Have you ever stopped to think how sometimes the person we least notice can be the very person who has the most to teach us? In Chicago, in the icy corridors of a skyscraper that was once a symbol of power, an unbelievable story was about to unfold. Ricardo Monteiro, one of the city's richest businessmen, had just lost everything. His $500 million fortune, his reputation, and most importantly, his faith in humanity. As he walked through the empty offices of the company he had spent 20 years building, a single light still shone on the top floor. It was Jorge Silva, the 58-year-old janitor who continued to clean every corner of that ghostly building, even though he knew no one would return. While Ricardo drowned in despair and rage, Jorge swept the floor with the same dedication as ever, as if each sweep of the broom were an act of resistance against the chaos. What neither of them imagined was that this encounter between the man who lost everything and the man who never had anything would not only change their lives, but also prove that sometimes the greatest treasure is right in front of us. We just haven't learned to see it yet. This is the true story of how a humble janitor taught a bankrupt millionaire that true success isn't measured by what you have in the bank, but by what you build in people's hearts. A lesson that will make you rethink everything you believe about value, work, and what truly matters in life. Prepare to discover how the invisibles of our society may hold the keys to a kingdom we never knew existed. Ricardo Monteiro slammed the office door so hard that the tempered glass shook for seconds. His hands sweated as he held the report that had just sealed his company's fate, a $200 million loss on investments that seemed guaranteed. The numbers danced before him like mocking ghosts, each red figure a stab at the pride he'd built over 2 decades. He looked out the 40th floor window and saw the city of Chicago stretched out like a chessboard, where he'd just lost the most important match of his life. Anger boiled in his chest like lava ready to explode. "You betrayed me," he shouted to the packed conference room, where 50 executives avoided his gaze. Each face represented years of trust gone to ash. Every person he considered family now seemed like a stranger. Ricardo pointed a finger at each of them, his voice echoing off the marble walls that had witnessed so many victories. "I trusted you with my life, my money, my dreams." Spit flew from his mouth as the words tumbled out like bullets from an out-of-control machine gun. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. The CEO, who was once called a visionary, now resembled a wounded animal, pacing like a caged lion. His hands shook not from fear, but from a fury so pure it seemed to burn from within. "You knew the numbers were wrong. You knew the contracts were flawed, and yet you let me sign." Each word was spat with the venom of someone who discovered his own shadow had betrayed him. Ricardo pulled at his Italian silk tie as if it were a noose around his neck, sweat dripping down his forehead despite the frigid air conditioning. The room that had once been his kingdom now felt like an arena where he was the defeated gladiator. "They're all fired." The sentence came out in a roar that made even the building's security guards stop and listen. Ricardo swept all the papers off the mahogany desk with his arm, documents flying like dry leaves in a storm of rage. $1 million contracts, strategic reports, family photos, everything was thrown onto the Italian marble floor. "I want everyone out within the hour, and if anyone tries to take anything that isn't personal, I'll sue the 5th generation." His voice cracked from shouting, but the pain in his chest was greater than any hoarseness. The executives began to rise silently, like ghosts abandoning a cemetery. The man who built an empire from scratch now watched it crumble in a matter of minutes. Ricardo slumped into the leather chair that cost more than a luxury car, but now felt like it was made of thorns. His hands covered his face as reality hit him like a hammer. At 52, he was alone, betrayed, and broke. The office that had once welcomed presidents and celebrities now echoed only with the sound of his heavy breathing and the ticking of the Swiss clock on the wall. Outside, Chicago continued its frenetic life, oblivious to the drama unfolding on the 40th floor of what was once the center of a corporate kingdom. The corridors that once bustled with the sound of hurried heels and business conversations now resembled a marble mausoleum. The echo of Ricardo's own footsteps sounded like gunshots in an abandoned cathedral, each footfall echoing for seconds that seemed eternal. The automatic light still flickered on as he passed, as if the building tried to maintain the illusion that there was still life within. Office doors stood open, revealing empty desks where switched-off computers looked like tombstones of buried dreams. The smell of coffee that had always perfumed these corridors was replaced by the cold, sterile odor of abandonment. The ornamental plants that decorated each floor were beginning to wilt, their leaves yellowing like the hope that once blossomed in those spaces. Ricardo stopped in front of the main meeting room, where the oval oak table still bore the marks of water glasses from the last meeting. The pictures on the walls showed growth charts that now seemed like cruel jokes, green arrows pointing upward in a razor-sharp irony. The sound system that played classical background music during work hours was now muted, leaving only the low hum of the air conditioning as a soundtrack to the desolation. Each room told the story of a company that died in a matter of hours. The elevators continued to operate, but they rose and fell empty like mechanical ghosts following a purposeless routine. Ricardo pressed the button for the 35th floor and watched the numbers change on the digital display. Each floor a reminder of departments that no longer existed. The finance department, where brilliant analysts transformed numbers into strategies, was now nothing more than a graveyard of abandoned spreadsheets. The marketing department, which created award-winning campaigns, left behind only posters for products that would never be sold again. The creativity that once pulsed in those spaces evaporated like smoke, leaving only the cold skeleton of a soulless structure. The panoramic windows that once offered Chicago's most expensive view now served only to show a city that continued to spin while his world stood still. Ricardo pressed his forehead against the icy glass and felt the contrast between the warmth of his skin and the coldness that took over everything. Below, people walked the sidewalks like ants, each with their own problems and dreams, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the skyscraper above them. Traffic flowed normally. The other buildings glowed with their office lights. Life continued its natural course, while his seemed to have stopped in time. The feeling of irrelevance was more painful than any financial loss. The silence was so profound that Ricardo could hear his own heartbeat, a sound that seemed amplified by absolute solitude. He tried turning on the reception radio, but even the music seemed out of place in this abandoned setting. The waiting room chairs remained arranged in perfect rows, as if still awaiting visitors who would never come again. The receptionist's phone rang once, making Ricardo jump, but it was only an automated call that quickly dropped. In that moment, he understood that the silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of life, of purpose, of future. Jorge Silva arrived at work at 6 a.m. as he had for 15 years, even though he knew there was no one left to see his work. He swiped his card on the still-working electronic clock, greeted the night porter with the same warm "good morning" as always, and retrieved his cleaning cart from the basement. His calloused hands arranged the cleaning products with the care of a surgeon organizing his instruments, each bottle in its proper place, each cloth folded with military precision. His navy blue uniform was impeccable, pressed and starched by his wife the night before, because for Jorge, the dignity of work began with personal appearance. He looked in the locker room mirror and adjusted the badge that bore his name in small letters, but which to him carried the weight of a medal of honor. The first floor was exactly as he'd left it the night before. Clean, organized, smelling of lavender-scented disinfectant. Jorge began his routine in the main lobby, wiping the marble surfaces with a damp cloth, reflecting the overhead lights like a reflecting pool. He knew every stain, every scratch, every imperfection on the floor like a father knows his child's scars. The polisher's movement was almost hypnotic, perfect circles transforming the dull marble into a crystal shine surface. Even with no one to walk on that floor, Jorge left it spotless, because for him, the quality of his work didn't depend on an audience. Climbing to the second floor, Jorge greeted the plants like old friends, watering each with the precise amount of water he'd learned over the years. "Good morning, Mrs. Fern," he murmured softly. "It's a little drier today, isn't it?" He knew the plants were the only living beings remaining in the building besides himself, and he treated each leaf with the care of someone who understands that life is life, regardless of its form. The windows received special attention. Jorge cleaned them inside and out, removing every fingerprint, every dried raindrop, until they were as transparent as air. The morning sun streamed through the clean glass and created rainbows in the spray, small miracles that only he was there to witness. On the third floor, where the meeting rooms were located, Jorge arranged each chair in perfect position, as if a board of directors were about to convene at any moment. He vacuumed the carpet with slow, precise strokes, creating stripes that showed the machine's path. The conference table was waxed with a special wax, applied in circular motions that made the wood shine like a mirror, reflecting the crystal chandelier that hung from the ceiling. Jorge arranged the pads of paper and pens in each place, aligned with the precision of a soldier preparing weapons for battle. For him, every detail mattered, because a job well done was a matter of character, not convenience. When he reached the 4th floor, Jorge paused for a moment and looked out the window at the city waking up below. He saw people rushing to catch buses, executives entering neighboring buildings, life happening at a frantic pace while he tended to an empty space. But there was no sadness in his gaze, only the serenity of someone who has found purpose in what they do. My work isn't about who sees it, he told himself, repeating the mantra his mother taught him as a child. It's about who I am. Jorge returned to the cart, picked up the microfiber cloth, and continued his mission to keep that place dignified, even if it was just for himself, because for Jorge Silva, integrity was non-negotiable, and a job well done was his way of praying. It was almost midnight when Ricardo decided to return to the office. Unable to sleep at home with the weight of the ruin hammering at his head, he used the access card that still worked and went straight to the 40th floor, expecting to find only darkness and silence. But when the elevator doors opened, a soft light coming from the hallway surprised him, accompanied by the rhythmic sound of a broom scraping the floor. Ricardo frowned, thinking it might be a burglar or someone unaware the company had closed. He tiptoed, following the sound that echoed through the empty corridors like a working ghost. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but out of curiosity about who the hell was there at this hour. As he turned the corner, Ricardo saw a figure hunched over a broom, moving with the precision of a craftsman sculpting a masterpiece. The man wore a navy blue uniform and worked with such intense concentration that he didn't even notice his boss. Ricardo stood there for a few minutes, mesmerized by the dedication of this man, sweeping every corner as if preparing the place to receive royalty. The light from the hallway created an almost sacred aura around the janitor, transforming the manual labor into something resembling a silent dance. It was the first time in weeks that Ricardo had seen anyone doing anything purposeful in that dead building. "Excuse me," Ricardo said quietly, trying not to startle the man. Jorge raised his head slowly, unhurriedly, as if he already knew someone was there. His eyes met Ricardo's, and there was no surprise in that look, only the calm of someone with nothing to hide. "Good evening, Mr. Monteiro," Jorge said with a discreet smile, leaning on the broom handle. "Sorry if the noise bothered you. I always work more slowly at night to avoid making too much noise." Ricardo was disconcerted. The man knew him by name, speaking to him as if it were normal to encounter him wandering the hallways in the wee hours. There was a dignity in that greeting that made Ricardo feel small in comparison to the simple greatness of that worker. You still work here?" Ricardo asked, his voice weaker than intended. Jorge smiled again, a smile that carried years of patience and understanding. "Yes, I do, sir. Someone has to take care of the place, right?" He resumed sweeping, but more slowly this time, as if to prolong the conversation. Ricardo watched the precise movements of the broom, the way Jorge carefully picked up each speck of dust, as if every speck of dust mattered. "But there's no one here anymore. The company closed. I fired everyone." Jorge stopped sweeping and looked directly into Ricardo's eyes, a look that seemed to see beyond the surface. "I know, sir, but my job doesn't depend on how many people are here. It depends on me being here." The simplicity of that answer hit Richard like a punch in the gut, but one that brought relief rather than pain. He leaned against the wall, his legs feeling shaky, and for the first time in weeks, it wasn't from anger or despair. It was from something he couldn't name, a strange feeling of being in the presence of something pure in a time when everything seemed rotten. Jorge continued sweeping, but now he was humming softly, a song Ricardo didn't recognize, a simple melody that seemed to bring peace to the tense atmosphere. "May I ask your name?" Ricardo asked, realizing that in 15 years he had never bothered to meet the man who ran his empire. "Jorge Silva, sir. Nice to finally speak with you." The word "finally" echoed in Ricardo's mind like a bell ringing to wake his slumbering conscience. Ricardo stood there for a few minutes, watching Jorge work with a dedication that defied all business logic he knew. The sound of the broom on the floor created an almost meditative rhythm, and for the first time in weeks, Ricardo felt his mind calm a little. But curiosity was stronger than the momentary peace, and the question hammering in his head needed to come out. "George," he said, interrupting the janitor's soft humming. "Can I ask you a question that's driving me crazy?" Jorge stopped sweeping and leaned on the broom handle, giving his boss his full attention as if it were the most important conversation in the world. His eyes shone with a patience Ricardo had never seen in any meeting room. "Of course, Mr. Monteiro. You can ask me anything you want." Jorge adjusted his uniform cap and folded his hands on the broom handle, a posture that blended respect with dignity. Ricardo took a deep breath, trying to formulate the question that seemed simple but carried the weight of all his confusion. Why do you still clean if no one comes here anymore? Why do you keep working in an empty building, unpaid, with no one to see what you do? The words came out in a rush, as if they had been pent up for a long time. Jorge smiled that calm smile that was becoming familiar, a smile that didn't judge, only understood. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that precedes important revelations. Jorge looked around the clean hallway, then back at Ricardo, as if choosing the right words to explain something very simple that the complicated world had forgotten. You know, Mr. Monteiro, I learned something from my mother when I was little. He paused, running his hand along the broom handle as if caressing an old friend. She used to say we don't work for people to see. We work because that's who we are. Ricardo frowned, trying to grasp the depth of that seemingly simple sentence. I don't clean this building because someone will see it or because I'll get paid for it. I clean because I'm a janitor, and being a janitor means caring, no matter what. Jorge's voice had a gentle firmness, like water that flows slowly but can move mountains. But that doesn't make financial sense, Ricardo protested, his businessman's mind trying to find logic in the situation. You're wasting your time, your energy, your cleaning products without getting anything in return. Jorge chuckled softly, a laugh that wasn't mocking, but understanding of his boss's confusion. Sir, with all due respect, you're thinking I'm not getting anything in return. He gestured to the clean hallway, the shine on the floor, the clean smell that perfumed the air. I get the satisfaction of knowing I did my job right. I get the peace of sleeping knowing I didn't abandon my responsibility. I get the pride of looking at this place and knowing it's the way it should be. Ricardo felt something stir in his chest, a strange sensation he couldn't identify. Besides, Jorge continued, slowly sweeping again, who said no one comes here? You're not here now. The question struck Ricardo like a bolt of lightning, illuminating a truth he hadn't realized. I take care of this place because you never know when someone will need it clean and organized. It could be you. It could be a buyer. It could be someone coming to pick up something. Jorge stopped sweeping and looked Ricardo directly in the eye. My job isn't about who sees, sir. It's about being ready when someone needs to see. In that moment, Ricardo understood he was confronted with a philosophy of life his Harvard education had never taught, a wisdom that came from a place much deeper than any business textbook. Jorge leaned on the broom like a wise man leans on a staff, and Ricardo realized he was about to hear something that would change his perspective on work forever. You know, Mr. Monteiro, this broom has already taught me more about life than any school could. He lifted the simple tool, observing it as if it were a rare treasure. It doesn't choose where it cleans. It doesn't complain if the floor is too dirty. It doesn't stop working because no one is looking. Ricardo approached, intrigued by the way Jorge spoke of such a common object with such respect. My broom does its job regardless of recognition, applause, or reward. It simply fulfills its function, and in that, it finds its purpose. Jorge's voice had an almost poetic cadence, transforming a conversation about cleaning into a philosophy lesson. When I was young, I thought work was just about money, about getting ahead in life, about impressing others. Jorge began walking slowly down the hallway, Ricardo at his side like two philosophers discussing the mysteries of existence. But over time, I understood that work is about identity. It's not what you do for a living. It's who you are when no one's looking. He stopped at a window and pointed to the city below. Look at all the lights on, sir. Each one represents someone working, someone fulfilling their role in the world. The doctor saving lives, the baker making bread, the driver taking people to their destinations. Ricardo looked at the city with new eyes, seeing not just buildings and lights, but a symphony of individual purposes creating collective harmony. My work doesn't depend on who sees it, sir. It depends on who I am. Jorge repeated the phrase like a mantra, each word filled with conviction. If I only cleaned when someone saw me, I'd be an actor playing the role of a janitor. But I clean because I am a janitor, in essence, in my soul. He touched his chest with his free hand, indicating where this certainty resided. The difference is that an actor stops acting when he leaves the scene, but a janitor continues to be a janitor, even when no one is watching. Ricardo felt a lump in his throat, realizing that for years he had been just an actor playing the role of a businessman, performing for the audience instead of being authentic to himself. The simplicity of that truth was both liberating and frightening. Do you want to know why I keep cleaning? Jorge smiled and went back to sweeping. But now every movement seemed like a practical demonstration of his philosophy. Because when I stop being who I am, I stop being who I am. And if I stop being who I am, then who is living my life? The question echoed through the hallway like a bell ringing in Ricardo's conscience. I'd rather be an authentic janitor than anything else false. I'd rather clean an empty building being true to myself than work in a crowded place being a liar about my essence. Jorge stopped sweeping and looked at Ricardo with gentle intensity. Work isn't about where you are, sir, it's about who you are, where you are. Besides, Jorge continued, scooping trash into a dustpan with the precision of an artist, I learned that integrity isn't something you turn on and off depending on the situation. You either have it or you don't. There's no middle ground. He dumped the trash into the bag carefully, as if even that gesture held meaning. If I only had integrity when someone was watching, then I wouldn't have integrity at all. It would just be convenient. Ricardo swallowed hard, remembering how many times he had made decisions based on convenience rather than integrity. My broom taught me that character is what you do when no one can reward or punish you for it. It's who you are in the dark, when only God and you know the truth. In that moment, Ricardo understood he was receiving a masterclass in authenticity from someone society considered just a janitor. Jorge's words about integrity and authenticity hit Ricardo like an avalanche, tearing down the last barriers he had built around his pain. His legs began to tremble, and he leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of decades of questionable decisions crashing down on his shoulders. Jorge, he said, his voice breaking, I think I lost more than money. I think I lost who I was. His hands trembled as he ran his fingers through his gray hair, messing up his always impeccable hairstyle. Or maybe I never knew who I really was. Jorge stopped sweeping and approached, not with pity, but with the solid presence of someone who knows how to listen without judgment. The silent hallway transformed into a makeshift confessional, where a ruined millionaire was about to bare his soul before a janitor. I built all this. Ricardo gestured to the building around them, his voice breaking with each word. 20 years of my life I sacrificed family, friends, health, everything to build this empire. And do you know what I discovered when it all fell apart? He looked at Jorge with eyes red with exhaustion and pain. That I hadn't built anything solid. It was all a facade, all appearances, all based on people I thought respected me, but who were only there for the money. Tears began to flow, and Ricardo made no effort to hide them. When the money ran out, they disappeared like rats abandoning a sinking ship. 20 years of relationships proved false in a matter of hours. Jorge listened silently, his presence more comforting than any words could be. Do you want to know the truth, Jorge? The truth I've never even admitted to myself? Ricardo slid down the wall until he sat on the cold hallway floor, his powerful CEO posture completely abandoned. I betrayed everyone before they betrayed me. I lied. I manipulated. I walked all over good people to get where I am. He covered his face with his hands, as if to hide from his own confession. I fired family men to cut costs. I signed contracts I knew would hurt small businesses. I made decisions thinking only of profit, never of people. His voice was muffled by his hands, but each word echoed through the hallway like a cry of regret. I became exactly the kind of person I hated when I was young and dreamed of changing the world. And you know what the most pathetic part of all this is? Ricardo lifted his head, looking at Jorge with a mixture of despair and relief at finally speaking the truth. I convinced myself it was normal, that this was how the business world worked, that everyone did the same thing. He laughed bitterly, a laugh that sounded more like crying. I created a bubble around myself, surrounding myself only with people who thought like me, who validated my bad choices, who told me I was a visionary when in reality I was just another greedy person. Jorge sat on the floor next to Ricardo, a simple gesture that broke down all hierarchical barriers between boss and employee. I lost my soul long before I lost my money, Jorge. The difference is that now I have nothing to distract me from the truth. Even my own team betrayed me, Ricardo continued, his voice taking on a tone of anger mixed with pain. People I considered family, who I helped advance my career, who I trusted with my most intimate secrets. He pounded his fist on the ground, the physical pain a welcome one compared to the emotional pain. They knew the numbers were wrong, they knew the contracts were flawed, and they let me sign anyway. They used me as a scapegoat to save their own skin. The tears flowed again, but now they were tears of anger, not just sadness. I created monsters, Jorge. I taught them to be like me, And when the moment of truth came, they showed me exactly who I taught them to be. Jorge reached out and touched Ricardo's shoulder, a touch that carried more compassion than any words of comfort. In that moment, the ruined millionaire understood he was receiving more humanity from a janitor than he had from decades of business relationships. Jorge was silent for a few minutes, letting Ricardo's words echo through the hallway like echoes of a confession that needed to be heard. When he finally spoke, his voice had the softness of someone who knows pain and the firmness of someone who has found wisdom in it. Mr. Monteiro, do you know what's the first thing we learn when we start cleaning floors? Ricardo raised his head, curious despite the pain that still pulsed in his chest. We learn that hidden dirt always appears. It may be under the rug, behind the furniture, in the corner no one sees, but eventually it surfaces. Jorge picked up a handful of dust he had swept and showed it to Ricardo. And when it appears, it doesn't come alone. It brings with it all the dirt that was hidden with it. You're suffering now because the dirt that was hidden for years has finally come to light, Jorge continued, carefully pouring the dust into the trash bag. But you know what the good news is? Dirt that appears is dirt that can be cleaned. The problem isn't having dirt, sir. The problem is pretending it doesn't exist. Ricardo observed Jorge's precise movements, each gesture laden with meaning that went far beyond physical cleanliness. I've cleaned a lot of floors in my life, and I can guarantee one thing. The dirtiest floor is always the one that looks the best after cleaning. Because when you really clean, you're not just removing the dirt on top. You're removing the dirt that no one saw, but that was there, eating away underneath. The metaphor was simple, but Ricardo felt each word as a profound revelation about his own life. When cleaning, we learn that it's no use just wiping it with a cloth and pretending it's clean. Jorge stood up and offered his hand to help Ricardo up as well. You have to scrub. You have to use a strong product. You have to be patient to remove old stains. And sometimes it hurts, because you have to scrub the injured area. Ricardo accepted the offered hand, feeling in Jorge's calloused skin a strength that came from years of honest work. But after you really clean, the floor looks like new. It doesn't look the same as before. It gets better, because now you know it's truly clean, not just on the surface. Jorge smiled, that smile that was already becoming a beacon of hope in Ricardo's darkness. You're at the scrubbing part now. It hurts, but it's necessary. You know what else cleaning has taught me? Jorge walked down the hallway again, Ricardo at his side, like two pilgrims on a journey of discovery. That everyone makes a mess. It doesn't matter if they're rich or poor, boss or employee, saint or sinner. Everyone dirties the floor wherever they go. He stopped before a stain on the marble that only a trained eye could see. The difference isn't not making a mess. The difference is taking responsibility for the mess you made and working to clean it up. Jorge bent down and began scrubbing the stain with a special cloth, using circular motions that gradually made the mark disappear. You made a mess, yes, but you're here, acknowledging it, wanting to clean it up. That's more than most people do. And there's another thing the floor taught me. Jorge finished cleaning the stain and stood up, admiring the results. That no matter how dirty it gets, it can always be cleaned. Always. It may take time. It may be hard work. It may require a special product, but it can always be cleaned again. He looked directly into Ricardo's eyes, and in that gaze was an unshakable certainty that made the businessman's heart race with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. You're not lost, Mr. Monteiro. You're just dirty. And dirt, no matter how old, always comes off when we truly want to clean it. Jorge held out the cloth to Ricardo, a symbolic gesture that carried the weight of a second chance. The question isn't whether it can be cleaned. The question is, are you willing to do the hard work to do it? Jorge put the cloth back in the cart and gestured for Ricardo to follow. Come with me, Mr. Monteiro. I want to show you something you might never have seen, even though I've worked here for so many years. They walked to the end of the hallway, where Jorge opened an inconspicuous door that Ricardo always thought was just a cleaning closet. This is the 40th floor mechanical room, Jorge explained, turning on the light and revealing a maze of pipes, wires, and equipment that kept the building running. I bet you've never been in here, have you? Ricardo shook his head, impressed by the complexity of what lurked behind that simple door. Engineers come here when there's a problem, but they only look at the broken part. I come here every day, so I see things they don't. Jorge pointed to a pipe that was slowly dripping into a puddle on the floor. See this leak here? Jorge bent down and touched the accumulating water. I've been reporting this to the maintenance department for 3 months. They always say they'll send someone, but they never do. He stood up and showed Ricardo a damp patch spreading across the wall. Meanwhile, the water is seeping into the structure. Soon, mold will start to appear in the office next door. Then it will damage the electronic equipment, and in the end, it will cost 10 times more to fix. Ricardo observed the situation with the eyes of a businessman, mentally calculating the costs of a repair that could have been avoided. But why don't the engineers see this? Jorge smiled sadly. Because they don't spend enough time here to notice. They come, fix the immediate problem, and leave. I stay. Jorge led Ricardo to another corner of the room, where an electrical panel displayed lights flashing in seemingly random sequences. This panel here controls the air conditioning system for 5 floors. See how some lights flash faster than others? Ricardo nodded, trying to understand the pattern. That means some motors are working harder than others to compensate for system failures. It's like a soccer team where some players have to run faster because others aren't doing their part. Jorge delicately touched one of the buttons, and Ricardo noticed how his hands moved with the confidence of someone who knows every detail of that equipment. The technicians look at the numbers on the computer upstairs, but I hear the noise the machines make. And when a machine is in trouble, it complains. You just have to know how to listen. Do you know the difference between me and the experts you hire? Jorge leaned against a pipe, speaking with the naturalness of someone who has found their truth. They know a lot about how things should work. I know how they actually work. He pointed to a valve that had been adjusted with wire instead of the original mechanism. This is a makeshift, but it's a makeshift that's been working for 2 years. The engineer would want to replace the entire valve, spend $5,000, and shut down the system for a week. I adjusted it with 50 cents of wire, and the problem is solved. Ricardo began to understand that he was being taught a lesson in the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. I'm not saying engineers are bad, sir. I'm saying they see the forest, but I know every tree. Jorge led Ricardo to a small window that overlooked the interior of the building, revealing ventilation ducts and structures hidden from view. Do you want to know why your company had so many problems that the experts couldn't foresee? He pointed down, where other floors could be seen through the technical openings. Because you only listened to those who spoke the language you understood. But the people who truly understand the problems are the people who deal with them every day. Ricardo felt a shiver run down his spine, realizing how many times he had ignored reports from minor employees because they weren't packaged in the corporate jargon he was used to hearing. I know where every pipe leaks, where every wire is overloaded, where every structure is giving way. Not because I studied this in college, but because I spend 8 hours a day dealing with all of this. And if you had asked me, I would have told you. Ricardo stood still for a few minutes, absorbing everything Jorge had shown, feeling as if he were seeing his own building for the first time. The hidden complexity, the ignored problems, the wasted knowledge, it all echoed in his mind like puzzle pieces finally beginning to fit together. Jorge, he said slowly, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. In 20 years of building this company, I never thought to ask you what you knew. His hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from a strange excitement, as if he were discovering a hidden treasure in his own backyard. I always thought knowledge came from diplomas, expensive consulting, sophisticated reports. I never imagined that the person who knows my building best was someone I saw every day but never really saw. Jorge smiled with that infinite patience that seemed to be his trademark, but Ricardo noticed something different in the janitor's gaze, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. You're not the first boss to think that way, and you won't be the last, Jorge said, arranging some tools on a makeshift shelf. The difference is that you're here, willing to learn. Most don't even do that. He turned to Ricardo with an expression that mixed kindness with determination. And you know what? You have an advantage that most business owners don't. Ricardo frowned curiously. You lost everything, and when you lose everything, you're free to rebuild the right way. The simplicity of that observation struck Ricardo like a ray of light piercing a storm, illuminating possibilities he hadn't considered before. Are you serious? Ricardo asked, and for the first time in weeks his voice held something other than despair or anger. Do you really think you can still do anything with all this? He gestured to the building around them. But this time the gesture wasn't one of defeat. It was one of genuine questioning. Jorge laughed softly, a laugh that sounded like music after so much silence. Mr. Monteiro, you're asking the wrong person if anything can be rebuilt. I spend my whole life fixing things that others think are beyond repair. He patted an old, perfectly functioning pipe. The difference is that now you can build based on what really matters, not what looks pretty on paper. Ricardo felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Hope. But I don't have any more money. I don't have any more team. I don't have anything, Ricardo protested, but his voice lacked the bitterness it once had. It carried the urgency of someone seeking solutions. Jorge stopped what he was doing and looked Ricardo directly in the eye, with an intensity that made the businessman feel completely seen. Sir, with all due respect, you're looking at this the wrong way. He pointed to himself, then to Ricardo. You have business knowledge. I have practical knowledge. You know how to talk to investors. I know how to make things really work. You understand strategy. I understand execution. Jorge's voice grew stronger with each word, as if he were seeing something Ricardo couldn't yet see. Apart, we're nothing special. But together we can be something no one expects. Ricardo felt his heart race, not with anxiety, but with an excitement he hadn't felt since his early days as an entrepreneur. Are you suggesting that we work together? The question came out almost as a whisper, as if he were afraid to break the spell of the moment. Jorge smiled, and this time the smile was different. It was the smile of someone who sees a possible future unfolding on the horizon. I'm suggesting that you stop thinking of me as a janitor and start thinking of me as a partner. He extended his calloused hand to Ricardo, a simple gesture that carried the weight of a revolution. I know this building better than any architect. I know the problems no one sees. I know the solutions no one imagines. And you know the business world. Ricardo looked at the outstretched hand, realizing he was facing a choice that could change not only his life, but his understanding of what it truly means to build something of value. Slowly, he extended his own hand, and when their two met, he felt for the first time in months that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. The next morning, Ricardo arrived at the building earlier than usual, carrying 2 coffees and an energy he hadn't felt in months. He found Jorge in the lobby, as always, but this time there was no surprise in the encounter. There was anticipation. Good morning, partner, Ricardo said, offering one of the coffees, and the word partner sounded strange in his mouth, but good, as if he were trying out a new language he'd always wanted to speak. Jorge smiled and accepted the coffee, a simple gesture that sealed the agreement made the night before. Good morning, Mr. Monteiro. Ready to meet the rest of the team? Ricardo frowned, confused. What team? Jorge chuckled softly and gestured for Ricardo to follow him. You didn't think I was the only invisible still around, did you? They walked toward the basement, and Ricardo realized he was about to discover a world that had existed right under his nose for years. In the basement, in a room Ricardo had never seen, 5 people sat around a makeshift table, drinking coffee from a thermos and eating homemade bread. Everyone, Jorge announced, this is Mr. Monteiro, the building owner. Mr. Monteiro, this is my team. A woman of about 45 stood up first, extending her hand with a warm smile. Maria Santos. I'm a cleaner on the 20th to 30th floors. Her voice had the firmness of someone unapologetic about their work. A black man of about 50 introduced himself next. João Pereira, night security for 12 years. Then came a young woman of about 25. Ana Silva. I cleaned the bathrooms and kitchens. A gray-haired man. Carlos Mendez, general maintenance. And lastly, a young man of about 30. Pedro Oliveira. I was in the warehouse. Ricardo shook each hand, realizing he was meeting people who had worked in his building for years, but who to him had always been just uniforms passing through the hallways. You still come to work here? Ricardo asked, genuinely surprised. Maria laughed, a laugh that held no bitterness, only realism. We have nowhere else to go, sir. And besides, this place still needs looking after. João added, and we've gotten used to each other. We've become family, you know? Ana, the youngest, spoke with a shyness that hid determination. Jorge told us about yesterday's conversation, about rebuilding things the right way. Carlos, the oldest, spoke with the wisdom of someone who has seen a lot. We're willing to help, if you want our help. Pedro, from the warehouse, added, we know this building like the back of our hands, and we know how to work. Ricardo felt a lump in his throat, realizing he was faced with a loyalty he had never inspired in his well-paid executives. But why would you do that? Ricardo asked, still trying to process the situation. I fired everyone. The company went bankrupt. You have no obligation to me. Maria exchanged glances with the others before replying. Sir, with all due respect, we're not doing this for you. We're doing this for ourselves. She sat back in her chair, speaking with the honesty of someone with nothing to lose. We spent years being treated like chattel, as if we were part of the building instead of people. But between us, we've always treated each other like family. João continued his reasoning. Jorge showed us that we have value, that we know important things. And now we want to prove it, not just to you, but to ourselves. Ana added with a passion that surprised Ricardo. We want to build something where we're respected for what we know, not ignored for what we haven't studied. Carlos stood up and walked over to a wall where a makeshift whiteboard hung, filled with notes, drawings, and lists. We've already started working, Mr. Monteiro. We've compiled a list of all the problems in the building that we know about, but that no one has ever asked us about. He pointed to different sections of the board. Maria mapped all the points where cleaning supplies are wasted. João identified all the safety flaws he sees every day, but that have never been reported. Ana cataloged all the malfunctioning equipment in the kitchens and bathrooms. Pedro showed an impressive list. And I've compiled an inventory of everything in the warehouse. Material that can be reused, equipment that can be repaired instead of thrown away. Ricardo looked at the makeshift board and saw more organization and practical knowledge than in the many expensive reports he'd paid for over the years. You did all this? Why? Jorge answered for everyone. Because finally someone is willing to listen to what we have to say, and we have a lot to say. Maria approached the board and pointed to a section filled with numbers and handwritten calculations. Mr. Monteiro, do you have any idea how much money this building wastes every month just on cleaning supplies? She picked up a makeshift folder filled with notes from school notebooks. I calculated, in my department alone, we threw away 30% of the products because the employees didn't know how to use them properly. Too much detergent, too little disinfectant, paper towels used as if they were free. Ricardo approached, impressed by the precision of the numbers. I know exactly how much of each product is needed to clean each type of surface, how long each task actually takes, which products work and which are just expensive marketing. Maria leafed through her notes with the pride of someone who discovered the value of her knowledge. If we reorganized just the cleaning department, we could save 40% of the budget without losing quality. In fact, we could improve quality. João joined the presentation, showing a detailed map of the building he had drawn himself. And security, sir. Do you know how many times I've reported problems that could have prevented accidents, robberies, even fires? He pointed to red dots scattered throughout the drawing. A camera with a blind spot here. A lock that doesn't work properly there. An emergency exit blocked by furniture on the 3rd floor. Ricardo examined the map, realizing that João knew every corner, every vulnerability, every strong point of the building. I spend 12 hours a day walking these corridors, sir. I know where thieves would try to break in. I know where fire would spread fastest. I know which elevators make strange noises before breaking down. João touched on different points on the map with the precision of a general explaining military strategy. And it's not just problems I see solutions too. Simple changes that would make this place safer than a bank. Ana, who had been quiet until then, perked up when her turn came. What about the bathrooms and pantries? Sir, everyone thinks they just clean and go, but I know things that can save a fortune. She showed a notebook full of observations about usage patterns, peak times, and waste. For example, the faucets on the 15th floor drip because the water pressure is too high. You don't need to replace the faucet, you need to adjust the pressure. Savings of $200 a month just on that. Ricardo shook his head, impressed. And the coffee machines? Half of them break because people don't know they need to descale them. I know how to perform preventative maintenance that makes them last 3 times longer. Ana leafed through the notebook with growing enthusiasm. Toilet paper, soap, paper towels. I know exactly how much each floor uses, at what time, which type of dispenser wastes the least. It seems trivial, but at the end of the year it adds up to thousands of dollars. Carlos, the maintenance man, approached carrying a box full of parts and tools. And maintenance, Mr. Monteiro. You used to call a specialized technician to replace a light bulb that cost $5, paying $200 in labor. He dumped the contents of the box on the table, revealing parts that looked like trash, but which his experienced eyes saw as treasure. This part here? The supplier charges $150. I can fix it with $10 in materials and 2 hours of labor. Carlos picked up a makeshift tool he had made himself. I know how to solder, I know how to work with wood, I know how to repair basic electronic equipment. I learned through hard work, because I always worked in places where I couldn't afford to hire specialists for everything. Ricardo watched Carlos's calloused hands work with a broken part, transforming it into something functional with precise and economical movements. Pedro opened a folder full of handwritten lists and spreadsheets, organized with professional precision. And the warehouse. Sir, Do you know how much valuable material was thrown away because no one knew it could be reused? He showed photos he'd taken with his cell phone of discarded equipment and materials. This printer here? They threw it away because it didn't work. The problem was just a clogged cartridge. I cleaned it and it works perfectly. Pedro turned the pages, pointing out item after item. This computer? Too slow. I formatted it, installed a more streamlined system, and it's running beautifully. He looked at Ricardo with a mixture of pride and frustration. I always wanted to suggest a recycling system, but no one ever asked my opinion. Now I've cataloged everything. What can be repaired? What can be reused? What really needs to be discarded? Ricardo realized he was looking at a treasure trove hidden in his own trash, managed by someone the company had always treated as disposable. Jorge clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. Everyone, enough theory. Let's show Mr. Monteiro in practice what we can do. He pointed to a list on the board. Remember the air conditioning problem on the 25th floor that the technicians couldn't fix 3 months ago? Maria smiled, already knowing where Jorge was going with this. The one that makes the room too hot in the morning and too cold in the afternoon? João added. And that has already cost 2 visits from a specialized technician without solving anything. Ricardo vaguely remembered the problem. He had spent almost $3,000 on diagnostics and attempted repairs, but the system still malfunctioned. Do you know what's causing this? Ana chuckled softly. We not only know what the problem is, but we know how to fix it. Carlos grabbed his toolbox and motioned for everyone to follow. Come on, Mr. Monteiro. A practical lesson on how to solve problems that specialists can't solve. They went up to the 25th floor, where it was uncomfortably hot even with the air conditioning on. Pedro went straight to a control panel Ricardo hadn't even known existed. The problem isn't with the equipment, sir. It's in the programming. He showed a screen full of numbers and settings. The technicians are fiddling with the mechanical part, but the problem is electronic. Maria joined in the explanation. I clean here every day, so I know exactly when the problem occurs. Always at 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. João added, and I patrol here at night, so I know that after 6 p.m. the system works perfectly. Ana pointed to a ventilation grill. And I know that the airflow changes direction at these times, because I feel it when I'm cleaning. Carlos opened the control panel and showed Ricardo a jumble of wires and circuits. See this timer here? It's programmed to change the temperature based on daylight saving time, but no one updated it when the time changed. Pedro laughed. The technicians spent 3 hours testing the compressor, filter, and air duct. They never even looked at the timer. Carlos grabbed a screwdriver and began making simple adjustments. 5 minutes of work, $0 for a new part. Maria timed it on her cell phone. 3 minutes and 40 seconds to be exact. The sound of the air conditioner changed subtly, and within minutes the room temperature began to return to normal. Ricardo stood there, open-mouthed, watching a $3,000 problem being solved with practical knowledge and teamwork. How did you know that? Ricardo asked, still processing what he had just witnessed. Jorge smiled. Because we're here every day. Sir, we live with problems, so we learn to understand them. Maria explained. When you clean the same place every day, you notice patterns. When it's too hot, I sweat more. When it's too cold, my hands get dry from the cleaning product. João added, when you work security, you pay attention to everything that changes. Different noises, different temperatures, anything out of the ordinary. Ana added, and when you work as a true team, you gather information. I knew the airflow. Maria knew the time. João knew it worked at night. Carlos knew how to use the equipment. Pedro concluded, and I knew it had to be a programming issue, because I've seen it happen with other equipment. Ricardo sat in a nearby chair, feeling a mixture of admiration and embarrassment. You solved in 5 minutes a problem that cost me $3,000 and 3 months of headaches. Carlos put away his tools with the ease of someone who had just completed a routine task. The difference, Mr. Monteiro, is that the technicians came here to fix an air conditioner. We live here, so we know the air conditioner is part of our home. Jorge approached Ricardo. And this is just the first demonstration. Sir, we have a list of 47 problems that can be solved this way, with practical knowledge and teamwork. Maria showed her notebook, and each problem solved means money saved, increased efficiency, and a better working environment. Ricardo looked at that group of people he had always considered basic employees, and realized he was standing before a team of specialists that no college can teach you how to train. You are not employees, he said slowly, his voice filled with profound revelation. You are consultants, the best consultants I've ever seen. Over the next few days, Ricardo began spending more time with each team member. discovering talents that had been hidden for years beneath uniforms and prejudices. Maria was the first surprise. When he asked her to explain how she would organize the building-wide cleaning system, she pulled out a notebook and began drawing complex flowcharts with the precision of an efficiency consultant. "Sir, I've always wanted to implement a rotating system based on density of use," she explained, showing hand-drawn graphs that mapped foot traffic by floor and time. "The bathroom on the 5th floor needs to be cleaned 3 times a day, but the one on the 38th floor can be cleaned every other day." Ricardo observed her calculations and realized that Maria had an analytical mind to rival any MBA. "And if we implement color coding for products and timers for tasks, we can increase efficiency by 60% without hiring anyone." She spoke with the passion of someone who could finally show off what she knew, and Ricardo wondered how many other talents he had wasted over the years. João revealed himself to be a natural strategist when Ricardo asked his opinion on security. "Sir, security isn't about expensive equipment. It's about psychology and prevention," he said, spreading blueprints of the building on the table. "Thieves think like water. They always look for the easiest way." He began marking strategic points with a red pen. "If you put a camera here, the guy will enter that way. If you block it there, he'll try this way." Ricardo watched João transform the building map into a veritable military strategy, identifying vulnerable points that no security company had mentioned. "And it's not just about preventing entry, sir. It's about creating a flow of people that naturally inhibits suspicious behavior." João demonstrated how small changes in furniture arrangement and lighting could create natural surveillance among the building's users. "I studied this on my own, reading library books and watching videos online. I always wanted to apply it, but no one asked my opinion." Ana surprised Ricardo with her knowledge of ergonomics and workplace well-being. "Sir, I spend all day observing how people use spaces," she said, showing a notebook full of behavioral observations. "I know what time each bathroom is busiest, which sink people prefer to use, which dispenser height causes the least waste." She opened a page full of hand-drawn technical drawings. "If we change the height of this mirror by 5 centimeters, people will stop spilling water on the floor. If we change the position of this trash can, we will reduce trash thrown on the floor by 80%. Ricardo realized that Ana had developed a deep understanding of human behavior that organizational psychologists charged a fortune to teach. "And in the kitchens, sir, I know exactly how to organize to reduce lines, reduce waste, and increase satisfaction. It's not about having better equipment. It's about understanding how people really behave." Carlos revealed himself to be a natural inventor when he showed Ricardo his gambiarras, which were actually creative and efficient engineering solutions. "Sir, necessity is the mother of invention, and I've always worked in places with little money," he said, showing a collection of tools he had modified or created himself. "This wrench here, I adapted it to reach screws in impossible places. This vise, I made it with parts from a broken washing machine." Ricardo observed each invention with growing admiration. "And it's not just tools, sir. I've created entire systems." Carlos showed photos of installations he had done in previous jobs. A rainwater harvesting system made with PVC pipes and an aquarium pump. A natural ventilation system that saves 40% of electricity. He spoke with the pride of someone who knew his creations worked better than expensive commercial solutions. "I always wanted to study engineering, but I never had the money. So I became an engineer by doing." Pedro was the biggest surprise of all when Ricardo discovered he had transformed the warehouse into a sophisticated logistics operation. "Sir, I've always been good with numbers and organization," Pedro said, showing spreadsheets created on the public library computer. "I created an inventory control system that predicts when each item will run out, based on historical usage patterns." Ricardo examined the spreadsheets and saw a level of analysis that consulting firms charged thousands of dollars to develop. "And it's not just control, sir. I optimized the entire warehouse layout based on frequency of use and item weight." Pedro showed before and after photos of the reorganization. 70% reduction in search time, 50% less physical effort, 0 inventory errors in the last 6 months. He smiled shyly. "I always wanted to work in logistics, but I only had a high school diploma. So I turned the warehouse into my learning laboratory." Ricardo realized that he had before him not only loyal employees, but a team of self-taught specialists who had developed world-class expertise in their fields, driven by a passion for doing things well and the need to solve problems with limited resources. Ricardo woke up on a Tuesday morning and, for the first time in months, felt like going to work. Not because he had to solve problems or put out fires, but because he was eager to learn more from his unlikely team. He traded his Italian suit for jeans and a polo shirt, a change that symbolized much more than clothing. It was the transformation from a distant CEO to a present collaborator. When he arrived at the building, instead of going straight to the 40th floor, he went down to the basement where the team met every morning. "Good morning, everyone," he said, and for the first time the phrase sounded natural, not formal. Maria smiled. "Good morning, Ricardo." The use of his first name, without the sir, marked a change he not only accepted but embraced. "What are we going to learn today?" Over the next few weeks, Ricardo transformed from boss to apprentice. He followed Maria through the floors, learning not just about cleanliness but about observation, patterns, and efficiency. "Do you see that stain on the carpet over there?" Maria asked, pointing to something barely visible. "That tells me there's a leak upstairs, probably in the women's bathroom. Third stall from the left." Ricardo frowned. "How do you know that?" Maria smiled. "Because I know every stain in this building. Each one tells a story." She led him upstairs, and sure enough, they found a small leak exactly where she'd predicted. "That's scientific investigation," Ricardo murmured, impressed. "That's paying attention," Maria corrected gently. "Something you learn when your work truly matters to you." From João. Ricardo learned about leadership through example. Security isn't about giving orders, it's about inspiring trust, João explained as they made their nightly rounds together. "When people see me, they have to feel like everything's under control, even when it's not." Ricardo watched as João greeted everyone they met. The outsourced cleaners, the delivery drivers, even the homeless people who sometimes sheltered at the entrance. "You know everyone by name," Ricardo commented. "Of course," João replied. "How am I supposed to protect people I don't know? Security starts with relationships." Ricardo realized that in 20 years as CEO, he had never known his employees as people, only as functions. "You're more of a leader than I ever was," he admitted. João shook his head. "You're learning to be a leader now. The difference is that now you want to learn." Anna taught Ricardo about empathy through observing human behavior. "Do you see how that lady always uses the same bathroom on the 15th floor?" Anna asked during one of their observation walks. "She has arthritis in her hands, so she needs the lowest sink and the faucet that doesn't require much force to turn on." Ricardo had never noticed these details. "And the guy on the 22nd floor who always eats lunch alone in the cafeteria? He's not antisocial, he's shy. If we rearrange the tables, create smaller, more welcoming spaces, he'll feel more comfortable interacting." Anna showed how small changes in the environment could profoundly impact people's well-being. "Business isn't about numbers, Ricardo. It's about people. And people have needs that go far beyond what's written in their employment contracts." Ricardo began to see the building not as a real estate asset, but as a complex and delicate human ecosystem. Carlos transformed Ricardo from an executive into a practical problem solver. "Put your hand here," Carlos said, guiding Ricardo's hand to feel the vibration of a machine. "Do you feel that irregular tremor? That means the bearing is starting to wear out. If we replace it now, it'll cost $50. If we wait until it breaks, it'll cost $500. Ricardo learned to listen to what the machines were telling him, to sense problems before they became crises. "You have to stop thinking like an executive and start thinking like a mechanic," Carlos explained. "An executive wants quick results. A mechanic wants lasting results." He taught Ricardo how to use tools, to understand how things really worked beneath the elegant surface. "Your hands have never really worked," Carlos observed, looking at Ricardo's smooth palms. "But they can learn. And when your hands learn, your mind understands differently." Pedro completed the transformation by teaching Ricardo about real systems and processes. "You always thought big, but you never understood the details that make big work," Pedro explained, showing how every small decision in the warehouse affected the entire building's operation. "Now you're learning that greatness comes from the sum of small excellences." Ricardo realized he was becoming a different person, not just a better businessman, but a more complete human being. The news of Monteiro Solutions' success hit Ricardo's former executives like a slap in the face. Marcus Thompson, formerly vice president of finance, was the first to react with indignation when he learned that the Janitor company was winning million-dollar contracts. "This is a sick joke," he said at an informal gathering in a chic Chicago bar, surrounded by other equally embittered former employees. "Ricardo has completely lost his mind. He's playing businessman with the cleaning crew." Sandra Williams, former marketing director, laughed scornfully. Have you seen their website? It looks like a child made it. Pictures of the consultants in uniform, handwritten testimonials. It's pure amateurism. The whole group laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, because deep down they knew something was working in a way they couldn't understand. The worst part is they're getting clients, admitted Robert Chen, former COO, with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Johnson and Associates canceled the contract with McKinsey to hire these janitors. He spat the last word like venom. How can a serious company choose janitor advice over Harvard Consulting? Marcus slammed his fist on the table. Because they're charging peanuts. It's unfair competition. They don't have the costs of a real consulting firm. Sandra agreed. Exactly. They don't pay executive salaries, they don't have a decent office, they don't invest in professional marketing. It's pure dumping. The group murmured agreement, trying to find explanations that wouldn't hurt their already bruised egos. Things got worse when stories began circulating about the results Monteiro Solutions was delivering. Petrotech saved $2 million in 6 months by following their recommendations, Robert said, reading an article in the local newspaper. $2 million, with Janitor Consulting. Marcus snatched the newspaper from his hands. This has to be deceptive marketing. There's no way they achieved results we couldn't. Sandra grabbed her cell phone and started making calls. I'm going to find out what's really going on. I have contacts at Petrotech. But when she called, the response was even more frustrating. Sandra, I know you guys were good at presentations, but these guys really understand how things work in practice. They solve problems you didn't even know existed. The final straw came when they discovered Ricardo was being invited to speak at universities about authentic leadership and practical knowledge-based management. He's become a motivational guru now, Robert said sarcastically, showing a YouTube video where Ricardo talked about the importance of valuing the knowledge of rank-and-file employees. Look what he's saying. The best consultants in my company are people society considers disposable. Marcus exploded. He's indirectly calling us incompetent. He's saying that janitors understand business better than MBAs. Sandra watched the video with growing irritation. And the worst part is that he's being applauded. Look at the audience. Harvard professors applauding a guy who bankrupted his own company. The group fell silent, processing the irony of seeing their former boss being celebrated precisely for having rejected everything they stood for. You know what this means, right? Marcus said, his voice filled with cold anger. If he succeeds, if this nonsense works, we'll be remembered as the incompetents he fired to hire better people. Robert swallowed hard. Our reputation in the market will go down the drain. Who would want to hire executives who were replaced by janitors? Sandra stood up, determined. Then we can't let that happen. We need to prove that this is just beginner's luck, that it won't last. Marcus smiled mischievously. Exactly. And I know exactly how to do that. We know Ricardo's weaknesses better than anyone. And a janitor may know how to clean floors, but he doesn't know how to deal with real market pressure. The group leaned forward, interested. We're going to show the market that serious consulting is for serious people, and that this joke about valuing practical knowledge is just a fad that will pass. Little did they know they were about to discover that underestimating people who really know how to work is one of the most costly mistakes you can make in business. The former executive's first attack came through a whisper campaign in the market, questioning the credibility of Monteiro Solutions. Marcus used his contacts to spread doubts. Are you really going to entrust strategic decisions to people without higher education? But the strategy had the opposite effect. James Morrison, CEO of Morrison Industries, who had heard the rumors, decided to test Ricardo's team with an impossible challenge: solve a productivity problem that 3 renowned consulting firms had failed to solve. If you're as good as you say, he challenged, prove it. Jorge smiled. Mr. Morrison, we don't say we're good, we show it. Within 2 weeks, Carlos had identified that the problem wasn't in the production line, but in the ventilation system that was making employees drowsy after lunch. A $500 solution that increased productivity by 25%. News of the success at Morrison Industries spread like wildfire, and something interesting began to happen. Other entrepreneurs began seeking out Monteiro Solutions, specifically because they wanted consulting from people who actually work. I'm tired of paying a fortune to hear theory, said Patricia Walsh, owner of a restaurant chain. I want someone who understands what happens in the kitchen, not in the boardroom. Anna spent a week working in Patricia's restaurants, not as a consultant, but as an employee, understanding each process firsthand. The problem isn't the menu or the marketing, she reported. It's that you have 40% food waste because no one understands the actual consumption patterns by time and day of the week. Within a month, Anna had created a forecasting system based on practical observations that reduced waste by 60% and increased customer satisfaction. What impressed clients most was the team's brutal honesty. When Technocorp offered a $200,000 contract to optimize processes, Pedro was blunt. "Sir, your processes don't need optimization. They need simplification, and we can do that in 2 weeks for $20,000. The CEO was shocked. "You're turning down $180,000. Pedro smiled. "I'm offering an honest solution. If we charge $200,000 for a $20,000 job, we'll be like everyone else you've hired before." Technocorp not only accepted the lower offer, but also became a loyal customer and began recommending Monteiro solutions to other companies. "I've finally found consultants who don't want to sell me what I don't need," the CEO commented at a business conference. The team's authenticity created a phenomenon no marketing strategy could buy. Genuine word of mouth. "These guys are different," business owners commented at events. "They don't try to impress with technical jargon. They speak clear Portuguese and deliver real results." Maria became famous in the hotel industry for her ability to train cleaning teams that actually worked. "She doesn't just teach technique," one manager commented. "She teaches pride in work. After she trained our team, turnover dropped 80%. João became a benchmark in corporate security, not by using expensive equipment, but by creating systems based on human psychology and common sense. He reduced our security incidents by 90% without spending a dime on new equipment," a plant director reported, "just by changing the way we think about security." The turning point came when Harvard Business Review published an article about Monteiro solutions, titled "The Practical Knowledge Revolution." The article highlighted how a team without MBAs was outperforming traditional consultancies through expertise based on real experience, not academic theory. Ricardo was invited to give a talk at Harvard itself, where he said, "You teach how businesses should work. My team knows how they really work." The audience of professors and students fell silent, then burst into applause. "The difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom," Ricardo continued, "is that theory explains why something should work. Practice shows how to actually make it work." After the talk, 3 professors approached Ricardo, wanting to study Monteiro Solutions methods. "You created something that academia lost," one of them admitted. "You reminded the business world that real competence comes from doing, not from studying about doing." At that moment, Ricardo realized they had not just created a successful company. They had started a movement that was changing the way the corporate world thought about value and knowledge. 6 months after launching Monteiro Solutions, Ricardo found himself in a situation he never imagined, turning away clients. The makeshift basement meeting room had a 3-month waiting list, and companies were offering million-dollar contracts that the team simply couldn't handle. "We have a good problem," Jorge said in a morning meeting, smiling as he showed off a stack of proposals. "The problem is that we don't want to grow too fast and lose quality." Maria agreed. "If we accept everyone, we'll become like the big consulting firms. Too many clients, too little care." Ricardo watched the discussion with admiration, seeing how his team prioritized excellence over profit, a philosophy he had lost somewhere along his previous journey. "So, what do you suggest?" Anna raised her hand. "We select the clients who really need us, not those who just want to pay more." The careful client selection created something unexpected: genuine exclusivity. Companies began competing to be accepted by Monteiro Solutions, not the other way around. "It's the first time I've seen a consultancy interviewing a client instead of a client interviewing a consultancy," commented David Park, CEO of Park Industries, after going through a selection process, where Pedro questioned whether the company was truly willing to implement practical changes or just wanted a pretty report. "You're more rigorous than a bank granting a loan," Carlos laughed. "The difference is that a bank wants a guarantee that they'll receive the money. We want a guarantee that we'll be able to deliver real results." This approach created a unique reputation in the market. Monteiro Solutions only accepted projects where it was certain it could make a significant difference. The numbers began to speak for themselves. In 8 months, the company had saved its clients over $15 million, with an average investment of just $50,000 per project. "The rate of return is absurd," commented a financial analyst studying the phenomenon. "They deliver $30 in savings for every dollar invested." But what was most impressive weren't the financial numbers. It was the human results. Companies reported not only cost savings, but improved employee morale, reduced turnover, and increased customer satisfaction. "They don't just fix processes," said Linda Chen, HR director at Chen Corporation. They fix organizational cultures. After their time here, our employees work with more pride, more purpose. Juan smiled when he heard this feedback. It's because we show that every job has dignity when it's done right. The media began to pay attention to the phenomenon. Forbes published a cover story, The Unlikely Consultants, How Former Janitors Are Revolutionizing the Corporate World. The Wall Street Journal ran a series of reports on the new economy of practical knowledge. CNN invited Ricardo and his team to a special program on business innovation. You're changing the rules of the game, the host said. How does it feel to be called disruptors? Maria laughed. We're not changing any rules. We're just doing what we've always known, but now someone is paying attention. Jorge added, disruption is a fancy word for saying we stopped pretending we didn't know the things we've always known. The simplicity of their answers contrasted with the complexity of the results they were achieving. The recognition culminated when Ricardo received a phone call that changed everything. The White House wanted to hire Monteiro Solutions for a pilot government efficiency project. You've managed to do in months what traditional consulting firms can't do in years, the presidential aide said. We want you to apply your methods to some federal agencies. Ricardo hung up the phone and looked at his team, who were working around the table as they always did. No pomp, no hierarchy, just focused on solving real problems. Guys, he said, his voice choked with emotion, the White House wants to hire us. The silence that followed was broken by Carlos. They know we don't wear suits, right? Everyone laughed, but it was the laugh of someone who knew they'd come a long way without losing their essence. The question isn't whether they know, Jorge said, smiling. The question is whether we're willing to show them that competence has no dress code. At that moment, Ricardo realized that their success wasn't just financial. It was living proof that authenticity and real competence always trump appearances and empty credentials. One Thursday night, after everyone had left, Jorge stood alone in the basement meeting room, staring at a newly arrived contract proposal. $500,000 for a 3-month project with a multinational corporation. He held the paper with hands that trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from a deep confusion that had been building inside him for weeks. $500,000, he muttered to himself. That's more money than I've ever made in my entire life. He stood and walked to the small mirror they'd placed on the wall, looking at his own reflection. Still the same face, still the same calloused hands, but now wearing a polo shirt instead of his navy blue uniform. Who are you now, Jorge Silva? He asked his reflection. Are you still a janitor, or have you become something else? The crisis had begun the week before, when Jorge was invited to speak at a business leadership conference in New York. He took the stage in front of 500 executives, all in suits, all with expensive degrees, all earning more in a month than he had earned in a year until recently. My name is Jorge Silva, and I work as a cleaner, he stammered at the beginning of his presentation. The audience laughed, thinking it was a joke, but Jorge felt the weight of their hesitation. After the talk, which was a resounding success, several executives approached him wanting to network. You should start your own consulting firm, one of them suggested. With your knowledge, you could make millions. Jorge smiled politely, but inside a voice whispered, is this what I want? Am I betraying who I've always been? The confusion intensified when Jorge visited his old neighborhood over the weekend. He stopped at the bakery where he always bought bread, but this time he arrived in a new car the company had bought for him. Donna Rosa, the baker who had known him for 15 years, looked at him with a mixture of pride and strangeness. Jorge, my son, you're different. You're more, more important. He tried to laugh. Donna Rosa, I'm the same Jorge as always. But she shook her head. No, my son. You're talking differently, dressing differently, even walking differently. You've become a boss. The word boss hit Jorge like a punch in the gut. He had always been proud to be a worker, to be on the side of those who do, not those who give orders. Have I become what I always criticized? He wondered on the way back. The crisis reached its peak when Jorge received a call from his cousin Antonio, who worked as a janitor in another building. Jorge, man, I need a job. I heard you've become a businessman now. I wonder if there's an opening. Jorge felt his heart sink. Antonio, of course there is. Come here tomorrow, and we'll talk. But after he hung up, he kept thinking, am I going to hire my cousin as an employee? I, who've always been an employee. Am I now going to be the boss of someone in my own family? He stayed awake all night, remembering the times he criticized bosses who didn't understand the reality of workers. What if I've become exactly that? What if success has transformed me into a person I don't recognize? The irony was cruel. He had helped Ricardo reconnect with his humanity, but now he was losing his own. The next morning, Jorge arrived at the office early and found Ricardo already there, drinking coffee and reading reports. "Good morning, Jorge. You look like you haven't slept." Jorge sat down heavily in his chair. "Ricardo, I need to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest with me." Ricardo put down the papers, noticing the seriousness in his friend's tone. "Of course, Jorge. What is it?" Jorge took a deep breath. "Do you think I'm still the same person you found sweeping the hallway that night?" Ricardo frowned. "Why are you asking this?" Jorge looked at his hands. "Because I'm afraid I've lost my way. I always knew who I was. Jorge Silva, a janitor, a hard-working man, proud of what he did. Now I don't know anymore. Am I a consultant? Am I a businessman? Am I a boss?" His voice trembled. "What if I've betrayed my own class? What if I've become another rich man who's forgotten where he came from?" Ricardo stood up and put his hand on his friend's shoulder, realizing that Jorge was facing the same identity crisis he had faced, only in the opposite direction. Ricardo looked into Jorge's eyes and saw a pain he knew well, the pain of questioning who you truly are when everything around you changes. "Jorge, before I answer your question, I need to tell you something I discovered about you a few weeks ago." He went to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder Jorge had never seen before. "Remember when you told me you learned about management by reading library books?" Jorge nodded curiously. "Well, I did some research on you, and I discovered something interesting." Ricardo opened the folder and showed documents that made Jorge's eyes widen. Jorge Silva, bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Illinois. 1995, specialization in operations management. GPA 3.8. Jorge went pale, as if he'd seen a ghost from his past. "How did you manage this?" Jorge asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ricardo sat down beside his friend. "I hired a private investigator, not to spy on you, but to better understand the team. And I discovered that you're not just a smart janitor, Jorge. You're a trained administrator who chose to be a janitor." Jorge lowered his head, his hands shaking slightly. "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" Ricardo asked gently. Jorge was silent for a few minutes, as if debating whether to open a door he'd kept closed for decades. "Because I was ashamed," he finally admitted. "Ashamed of having wasted my education, ashamed of having failed in life." His words were filled with an old pain he'd never shared with anyone. "When I graduated, I was 23 and thought I was going to conquer the world," Jorge continued, staring into the distance as if reliving painful memories. "I got a job at a consulting firm, wore a suit every day, and had a nice business card. I was exactly what you were before all this happened." Ricardo leaned forward, fascinated by the revelation. "But after 2 years, I realized I was becoming a person I didn't like. I lied to clients, sold solutions that didn't work, stepped on colleagues to climb the career ladder." Jorge paused, his voice breaking. "One day, I looked in the mirror and saw my father looking back at me. My father who always taught me that honest work is worth more than easy money. And I was doing exactly the opposite of what he taught me." "So you left everything behind?" Ricardo asked, beginning to grasp the complexity of the man beside him. Jorge nodded. "I left everything behind. Suit, high salary, fancy apartment, imported car. And I went looking for a job where I could look in the mirror every day without feeling ashamed." He smiled sadly. "My family thought I'd lost my mind. 'Did you study so hard to become a janitor?' my mother would ask. But I knew I'd made the right choice when I started sleeping well again." Ricardo felt a shiver run down his spine, realizing that Jorge had made the journey he was on now 25 years ago, only in the opposite direction. "You chose to be a janitor because you wanted to be a person of integrity," Ricardo murmured, more to himself than to Jorge. "Exactly," Jorge confirmed, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice gained strength. "I discovered that I'd rather be a genuine janitor than a fake executive. I'd rather earn a little doing something I was proud of than a lot doing something I was ashamed of." He looked Ricardo directly in the eye. "And do you know the irony of all this? Now that I'm using my degree again, I'm afraid I've lost the integrity I gained as a janitor." Ricardo shook his head, smiling. "Jorge, you don't understand, do you? You haven't lost your integrity. You finally found a way to use your training without losing your soul." He pointed to the folder containing the documents. "You're not a janitor turned consultant. You're a man of integrity who found a way to be an administrator while remaining human." Jorge looked at Ricardo with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand something fundamental about himself. "The difference isn't what you do, Jorge. The difference is why you do it. Ricardo stood and walked to the small basement window, looking out at the bustling city above. When he turned to Jorge, there was a determination in his eyes the janitor administrator had never seen before. Jorge, I have a proposal for you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. He returned to the table and sat down, his hands clasped as if he were about to make the most important negotiation of his life. I want you to be my partner, a real partner, not an employee, not a consultant. 50% of the company. Jorge almost choked on the coffee he was drinking. Ricardo, are you crazy? 50%. Ricardo smiled. Actually, I'm being selfish. You're worth more than 50%, but I still want some stake in the company you've transformed. The proposal echoed through the basement like thunder on a clear day. But Ricardo, I don't have the money to buy a stake in the company, Jorge protested, still processing the magnitude of the offer. Ricardo laughed. Jorge, you've already paid your share. You paid with knowledge, with integrity, with leadership. You transformed an empty building into a successful company. You transformed undervalued employees into an elite team. You transformed me from a bankrupt businessman into a decent human being. He pulled out a new folder and showed me the prepared legal documents. I've already had my lawyer prepare the paperwork. Monteiro and Silva Solutions, or Silva and Monteiro, if you prefer. Jorge looked at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. Are you serious? Ricardo nodded. I've never been so serious in my life. And what's more, I want you to be the CEO. The word CEO struck Jorge like a lightning bolt. CEO? Ricardo, have you completely lost your mind? I'm a janitor. Ricardo shook his head. No, Jorge. You're a natural leader who spent 25 years hiding behind a broom. You're the person this team respects, the one our clients trust, the one who has the vision to take this company to the next level. He leaned forward. I know how to manage, but you know how to lead. I know how to do business, but you know how to do the right thing. I have experience, but you have wisdom. Jorge remained silent, staring at the documents that represented a radical change in everything he knew about himself. But what about you? What would your role be? Ricardo smiled. I would be what I always should have been. A collaborator, not a dictator. You would be the CEO, I would be the COO. You would make the strategic decisions. I would handle the execution. Ricardo, this doesn't make sense, Jorge said, his voice trembling. You're the owner of the company. You have experience. You know the business world better than I do. Ricardo stood and placed his hands on Jorge's shoulders. Jorge, you still don't get it, do you? This isn't my company anymore. This is our company. And it only exists because you had the courage to prove me wrong about everything. He pointed upward, where the building stretched 40 stories. I built an empire based on ego and greed, and it crumbled. You built a team based on respect and competence, and it's conquering the world. Jorge looked at the documents again, this time with different eyes. Do you really think I can be CEO? Ricardo laughed. Jorge, you're already CEO. You just don't have the title yet. Jorge picked up a pen and stared at it for a few minutes, as if it weighed tons. If I accept this, I won't be a janitor anymore, he said, more to himself than to Ricardo. I'll be a businessman, a boss, an executive, everything I rejected 25 years ago. Ricardo shook his head. No, Jorge. If you accept this, you'll be what you've always been, a man of integrity who leads by example. The difference is that now you'll have the power to do it on a larger scale. He pointed to the door that led to the rest of the building. You can continue to be a janitor of a building, or you can be a janitor of the business world. You can continue cleaning floors, or you can clean up an entire industry. Jorge looked at the pen, then at Ricardo, then at the documents. What if I mess it up? What if I don't know how to be a CEO? Ricardo smiled. Then you'll learn, like you always have, and I'll be here to help you, like you helped me. Jorge took a deep breath, and for the first time since his identity crisis began, he knew exactly who he was and what he wanted to be. Jorge stared at the pen for long minutes, the silence in the basement broken only by the distant hum of the air conditioning they had repaired themselves months ago. When he finally looked up at Ricardo, there was a serenity on his face that surprised the businessman. Ricardo, I am deeply grateful for your offer, more grateful than you can imagine. He placed the pen back on the table, away from the documents. But I can't accept. Ricardo felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Why, Jorge? Don't you think you deserve it? Because I guarantee you deserve it more than anyone I know. Jorge smiled, that patient smile that Ricardo had learned to recognize as a sign of an important lesson coming. It's not about deserving, Ricardo. It's about understanding where my true value lies. You're offering me a title, a position, Jorge continued, standing up and pacing the small room. But my value isn't in a position, Ricardo. My value is in what I do, how I do it, why I do it. He stopped in front of the board where the notes from the first team meeting still sat. If I accept the position of CEO, I'll be measured by CEO standards. I'll have to wear a suit, attend boring meetings, deal with investors, and engage in corporate politics. Jorge touched one of Maria's handwritten notes. And then I'll stop being who I am and become who the position demands of me. Ricardo frowned, trying to understand the logic. But Jorge, you can be CEO your way. You can change what it means to be CEO. Jorge shook his head gently. No, Ricardo. Positions change people. People don't change positions. I learned that 25 years ago. Besides, Jorge continued, returning to the table but remaining standing, if I become CEO, what happens to our team? Will Maria still feel comfortable disagreeing with me when I become her boss? Will Carlos continue teaching me about machines when I have an executive title? He pointed to the door that led to the rest of the building. Will João continue treating me as an equal when I have an office on the 40th floor? Ricardo began to understand where Jorge was coming from. Our strength doesn't come from hierarchy, Ricardo. Our strength comes from equality. It comes from the fact that everyone here is respected for their knowledge, not their title. Jorge sat back down, looking Ricardo directly in the eye. If you give me a higher title than the others, you break the magic that makes this all work. So what do you propose? Ricardo asked, genuinely curious about how Jorge would resolve the dilemma. Jorge smiled and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. I propose we become partners, yes. 50-50 as you suggested, but without hierarchical titles. He began drawing an organizational chart, unlike anything Ricardo had ever seen. Instead of CEO and COO, we would be co-founders. Instead of boss and subordinates, we would be a cooperative of specialists. Ricardo examined the drawing, seeing connected circles instead of the traditional corporate pyramid. Each would be an expert in their field, but everyone would have an equal say in important decisions. Jorge pointed to each circle. Maria, an expert in operational efficiency. Carlos, an expert in practical solutions. Ana, an expert in human behavior. João, an expert in security and logistics. Pedro, an expert in systems and organization. And the two of us? Ricardo asked, pointing to two circles Jorge had left blank. Jorge filled one with Ricardo, strategy and business specialist, and the other with Jorge, leadership and integration specialist. You take care of the part you do best. Thinking big, making connections, opening doors. I'll take care of the part I do best, keeping everyone together, making sure we don't lose our essence. Ricardo looked at the organizational chart and felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. The feeling he was seeing something truly innovative. But how would this work in practice? How would we make decisions? How would we deal with investors who expect a traditional structure? Jorge laughed. The same way we've been doing it so far, Ricardo. With conversation, with respect, with consensus. And if investors don't like our structure, we'll find investors who do. He leaned forward. Because our structure is our competitive advantage. It's what makes us different from all the other consulting firms in the world. Ricardo stared at the circular organizational chart Jorge had drawn, and something clicked in his mind like a puzzle piece finding its perfect place. Jorge, you're not just refusing a position. You're proposing a revolution. He picked up the sheet and studied each connection between the circles. You're saying we can have a successful company without traditional hierarchy, without pompous titles, without all the structure I always thought was necessary. Jorge nodded. Exactly. And you know why this works? Because when you take away the titles, people stop competing for position and start collaborating for results. Ricardo felt a shiver of excitement, as if he were seeing the future of business unfold before him. This is more radical than any startup I've ever seen. But the revolution goes beyond the organizational structure. Jorge continued, taking another sheet of paper and starting to write a list. We need to revolutionize the values that guide our decisions. He wrote profit at the top of the sheet, then crossed it out and wrote purpose next to it. Instead of asking how much money will this make, we ask how much good will this do. Ricardo watched Jorge write more items. Growth crossed out, impact next to it, competition crossed out, collaboration next to it, efficiency crossed out, efficacy next to it. Every decision we make has to be filtered by these new values. Jorge looked at Ricardo. Are you willing to live by these values, even when they conflict with maximum profit? Ricardo took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. Jorge, 6 months ago I would have said you're being naive. That business is about money. Period. He picked up his pen and added an item to the list. People, instead of human resources. But now I understand that when you put purpose before profit, you end up making more money than when you put money first. Jorge smiled. Exactly. Because when people feel their work has purpose, they give their best. And when everyone gives their best, the results come naturally. Ricardo added another item. Sustainability, instead of growth at any cost. We only grow when we can maintain quality and values. And there's another thing, Jorge said, picking up the pen. We need to revolutionize how we treat our clients. He wrote partners instead of clients. We don't sell them services, we build solutions with them. Ricardo nodded, just like we've been doing. We don't arrive with a ready-made proposal. We listen first, truly understand the problem, and then build the solution together. Jorge continued, and we don't abandon them after the project ends. We remain available. We monitor the results. We adjust when necessary. Ricardo added, because our success is tied to their success. If they don't achieve lasting results, we've failed. Jorge smiled, and that creates something money can't buy. Genuine loyalty. But the most important revolution, Jorge said, his voice gaining an intensity Ricardo rarely heard, is how we will treat the people who work with us. He wrote family in large letters. Everyone who joins this company will be treated like family. It doesn't matter if they're a partner, a specialist, or an intern. Ricardo felt a lump in his throat, remembering how he had treated his employees at his previous company. We will know the names of each person's children. We will know when someone is going through a difficult time. We will celebrate personal victories alongside professional ones. Jorge continued, and when someone makes a mistake, we will teach, not punish. When someone has an idea, we will listen, not dismiss. When someone needs to grow, we will invest, not replace. Ricardo took the pen and wrote underneath, because people are not resources. People are the purpose. Jorge looked at the sentence and smiled. Now you understand, Ricardo. We're not building a company. We're building a new way of life. 3 weeks after the conversation about fees, Ricardo was at the building's reception desk when he saw a familiar group approaching the entrance. Marcus Thompson, Sandra Williams, Robert Chen, and other former executives were walking toward the building with a mix of arrogance and nervousness on their faces. Mr. Monteiro, Marcus said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Can we talk? We have a proposal that might interest you. Ricardo looked at them with a calmness that surprised even him. 6 months ago, the mere sight of those people would have sparked anger or bitterness. Sure, everyone. Let's go to the conference room. He led them not to the luxurious 40th floor, but to the basement, where the team was working. I hope you don't mind the more practical environment. The former executive's reaction upon seeing the basement meeting room was exactly what Ricardo expected. Sandra looked around with barely concealed disdain. Ricardo, do you really work down here? Robert muttered something about how the mighty fall to Marcus, who tried to maintain his professional composure. Mr. Monteiro, Marcus began, opening an expensive folder. We came here because we recognize that we may have been hasty when the company ran into difficulties. Jorge, who was in the room organizing some documents, stopped to observe the scene. Hasty? Ricardo repeated, genuinely curious about where this was going. What do you mean? Sandra stepped forward. What Marcus means is that we may have abandoned ship too soon. Now that we see the success of the new company, we'd like to come back. Back? Ricardo asked, and Jorge noticed a hint of amusement in his friend's voice. In what capacity? Robert leaned forward confidently. In our previous positions, of course, me as COO, Sandra as CMO, Marcus as VP of Finance. He gestured to the surrounding area. You clearly need a professional structure, people with real management experience. Marcus agreed. No offense to the people you hired, but serious consulting needs people with serious credentials. Jorge coughed discreetly, and Ricardo had to fight not to laugh. And what would you offer in return? Sandra gave a smile she found irresistible. Our experience, our contacts, our reputation in the market. You have the technical knowledge, we have the business know-how. Jorge approached the table, and Ricardo introduced himself. Everyone, this is Jorge Silva, my partner and co-founder of the company. The former executives looked at Jorge with a mixture of confusion and condescension. Ah, the janitor, Marcus said. extending his hand with a patronizing smile. I hear you have some interesting ideas about building maintenance. Jorge shook Marcus's hand firmly. Actually, I have an MBA in business administration and 25 years of experience in operations management. But thank you for the recognition. The silence that followed was awkward. Sandra tried to recover. Well, that's interesting. But you still need people with experience in large corporations. Jorge smiled. You mean the kind of experience that led the previous company to bankruptcy? The question hit like a slap in the face. Robert tried to regain control of the conversation. Look, let's be practical. You have a small, artisanal operation. To truly grow, you need a real corporate structure. Ricardo finally decided to intervene. Do you know what our current monthly revenue is? Marcus shook his head. 2.5 million. Net profit of 60%. The numbers made the former executives choke. And do you know how many employees we have? Sandra mumbled, no. 7, including me and Jorge. Ricardo stood up. You want to know why we don't need you? Because you represent everything that was wrong with the previous company. You think about titles, not results. You think about politics, not solutions. You think about impressing, not delivering value, Jorge added. And most importantly, you don't respect the expertise of the people who actually make the work happen. Marcus tried one last tack. Ricardo, you can't be serious. Are you going to choose janitors over trained executives? Ricardo smiled. Marcus, I didn't choose janitors over executives. I chose competent people over arrogant people. The difference is you never saw competence when it didn't come with a diploma hanging on the wall. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus, Sandra, and Robert looked at each other, clearly not expecting such a direct and reasoned rejection. Sandra tried one last approach, her voice taking on an almost pleading tone. Ricardo, we make mistakes. We admit it, but everyone deserves a second chance, don't they? Ricardo stood and walked to a wall where certificates and thank you letters from clients hung. Sandra, you've had your second chance, and your third, and your fourth. He pointed to a photo of the team at work. Every time a rank-and-file employee tried to suggest an improvement, you ignored them. Every time someone pointed out a real problem, you preferred to hire outside consultants. Jorge joined Ricardo. Second chances are for those who make mistakes due to inexperience. You made mistakes due to arrogance, and arrogance isn't cured with opportunity. It's cured with humility. Marcus tried to regain some dignity. Okay, Ricardo, but when this democratic company game goes wrong, when you need truly professional management, you know where to find us. Ricardo laughed, a genuine guileless laugh. Marcus, you still don't get it, do you? This is no joke. This is the future. He gestured to the surrounding area. While you were looking for jobs at other traditional companies, we were revolutionizing an entire industry. Jorge pulled out a tablet and showed a screen full of notifications. Harvard Business School wants to study our model. MIT wants us to give lectures on horizontal management. The White House wants to implement our methods in the federal government. The former executives stared at the screen with growing disbelief. And you know what the most ironic part is? Ricardo continued, his voice gaining an intensity that made everyone pay attention. You came here thinking you were going to save us, but actually you came here asking to be saved by us. He pointed to each of them. Marcus, you've been unemployed for 4 months. Sandra, you're working at a small agency earning a third of what you used to. Robert, you're freelancing because no one wants to hire a COO who oversaw a bankruptcy. The former executives' faces turned red, but Ricardo wasn't finished. You didn't come here to offer help. You came here to beg for relevance. Jorge added gently, and there's nothing wrong with needing help. The problem is not having the humility to admit it. Sandra finally burst out. Okay, we need jobs. Are you happy now? We messed up. We were arrogant. We underestimated you. Tears began to form in her eyes. But we have families. We have bills to pay. We have careers that have gone down the drain. Marcus and Robert lowered their heads, their facade of superiority finally crumbling. We don't know how to get jobs anymore in a world where janitors become CEOs and executives become unemployed. The raw vulnerability in Sandra's voice completely changed the energy of the room. Ricardo and Jorge looked at each other and something passed between them, a silent understanding that only people who have hit rock bottom can share. Ricardo sat back down, his posture changing from confrontational to compassionate. Sandra, do you want to know the difference between you and us? He pointed at Jorge. When I lost everything, I had the humility to accept help from a janitor. When you lost everything, you came here trying to maintain your arrogance. Jorge leaned forward. But humility can be learned. Respect can be developed. The question is, do you really want to learn, or do you just want to regain your old positions? Marcus lifted his head. What are you proposing? Ricardo smiled. We're not proposing anything. You're the ones who have to propose. If you really want to be part of this, you have to show us you've understood the lesson. Jorge added, and the lesson isn't about management or strategy. The lesson is about character, about treating people as people, not resources, about valuing competence, not titles, about serving, not ordering. Ricardo concluded, if you can learn this, maybe we can talk about how you can contribute, but not as bosses returning to their thrones, as apprentices starting from scratch. In the days following the former executive's visit, Ricardo found himself constantly thinking about the conversation. He watched Jorge lead the morning meetings with a naturalness that made it seem like it had always been that way, saw Maria explain efficiency systems with the passion of someone finally being able to tap into their full potential, watched Carlos solve complex problems with elegantly simple solutions. We've created something special here, he muttered to himself one Friday morning, looking out the basement window at the city bustling above. But do we have the courage to take this to the next level? The question echoed in his mind because he knew the next step would be the riskiest of all, completely relinquishing control. Jorge entered the room at that moment, carrying 2 cups of coffee and that calm smile Ricardo had learned to associate with moments of clarity. You look like you're thinking of something big, Jorge said, offering one of the cups. Or something scary. Ricardo laughed. Both, actually. He turned to Jorge. I'm thinking of doing something that goes against everything I've learned about business in the last 20 years. Jorge sat down, interested. Tell me about it. Ricardo took a deep breath. I want to transform Monteiro and Silva into a true cooperative, not just in structure but in ownership as well. Jorge almost spilled his coffee. Are you talking about dividing the company among all the team members? Ricardo nodded. Exactly. 7 equal partners, 7 equal votes, 7 equal shares in the profits. Ricardo, are you sure about this? Jorge asked, genuinely concerned. You're talking about giving up millions of dollars. Ricardo smiled. Jorge, 6 months ago, I had nothing, literally nothing. Today, I have a company worth millions, but more importantly, I have a family that respects me and a purpose that motivates me. He pointed to the door that led to the rest of the building. If I maintain majority ownership, I'll always be the boss, even if we try to be democratic. There will always be an invisible hierarchy based on who owns what. Jorge frowned. But what if it goes wrong? What if the team can't handle this responsibility? Ricardo laughed. Jorge, do you really think Maria, Carlos, Ana, Juan, and Pedro will care less about the company if it's theirs too? Or will they care more? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the rest of the team, coming for the weekly planning meeting. Guys, Ricardo said, after everyone had settled around the table, Jorge and I have a proposal for you, and it's a proposal that will change everything. Maria leaned forward. Good change or bad change? Ricardo smiled. That's for you to decide. He pulled out a folder he'd prepared overnight. I want to transform our company into a true cooperative. 7 equal partners, each with 14.3% of the company. The silence that followed was total. Carlos was the first to speak. Ricardo, are you serious? You want to give us part of the company? Ana shook her head. That doesn't make sense. Why would you do that? Pedro added. We don't have the money to buy a stake in a company worth millions. You don't need to buy anything, Ricardo explained. You've already paid for it with work, dedication, and loyalty. You've transformed an empty building into a successful company. Jorge joined in the explanation. And it's not just generosity, it's a smart strategy. When everyone is an owner, everyone cares like an owner. João, who had remained quiet until then, asked, and how would this work in practice? How would we make decisions? How would we divide responsibilities? Ricardo opened a document he had spent the night preparing. Important decisions by consensus. Each area has its own specialist in charge, but everyone has a voice in strategic decisions. Profits divided equally, but also responsibilities divided equally. Maria looked at her colleagues. Guys, do you realize what this means? We wouldn't be employees anymore. We'd be owners. Carlos laughed. Me? A company owner? My mother won't believe it. But then his expression became serious. Ricardo, are you absolutely sure about this? Because once we accept it, there's no going back. We'll be responsible for the success or failure of all this. Ricardo looked at each of them. Guys, you're already responsible for the success of all this. I just want to make official what's already a reality. The vote was unanimous. 7 hands raised, 7 nervous smiles, 7 people who had just become owners of a company they had built from scratch. "Then it's decided," Ricardo said, his voice choked with emotion. "As of today, there are no more bosses and employees here. There are 7 partners working together for a common goal." Jorge stood and extended his hand to Ricardo. "Welcome to Chicago's first truly democratic company." But it was Maria who broke the solemnity of the moment. "Guys, does this mean I can now complain about myself when I don't clean properly?" The laughter that followed echoed through the basement, filled with relief, joy, and a hint of disbelief at what they had just accomplished. In the weeks that followed, the transformation went beyond what any of them imagined. The first change was subtle, but profound. The way they talked about work. Our company replaced the company. Our clients replaced the clients. Our responsibility replaced my responsibility. Carlos, who had always been the most practical of the group, summed it up perfectly. "It's funny how differently we work when we know we're building something that's truly ours." Anna agreed. "Before I worried about doing my job well. Now I worry about the success of everything." The shift in mindset was immediately reflected in the results. Productivity increased 40% in the first month, not because they were working more hours, but because every decision was made with the good of the company as a whole in mind. The second transformation was in the way they dealt with clients. Pedro, who now felt truly invested in the success of each project, began following up on projects that went far beyond the original scope of the contracts. "If it's our company, then our reputation depends on the long-term success of our clients," he explained when Ricardo asked why he was dedicating extra time to a project that had already been completed. João implemented a continuous feedback system that turned clients into long-term partners. When you're an owner, you don't just want to hand over the project and walk away. You want to be sure it truly worked. Maria created a free training program for client employees, something no traditional consultancy would do. If they learn how to do it right, they'll need us less, but they'll recommend us to everyone. The third transformation was the most surprising. They began attracting talent in a completely new way. News that a company was offering real equity to all employees spread like wildfire. "You're getting resumes from people who would never dream of working at a traditional consulting firm," Jorge observed, leafing through a stack of applications. Senior engineers willing to start as junior specialists, Harvard MBAs wanting to learn practical management, even former CEOs interested in relearning leadership. Ricardo laughed. "And the most interesting thing is that we're attracting people for the right reason. They want to be part of something meaningful, not just make money." Anna added, "And since everyone who joins becomes a partner after a probationary period, everyone works from day one as if they were an owner." The fourth transformation was in their relationship with competitors. Instead of trying to destroy other consultancies, they began collaborating and even teaching their methods. "If our philosophy is right, then the more companies adopt it, the better for the whole world," Jorge explained when some partners questioned why he had agreed to give a talk to competitors. "We're not competing to be the only good company. We're trying to raise the bar for the entire industry." Carlos, ever pragmatic, added, "And besides, when we teach our methods, we learn too. Every company that tries to implement our philosophy shows us a different way of doing things." Ricardo observed this evolution with growing admiration. "Do you see what happened? We didn't just create a different company. We created a movement." Jorge smiled. "And the best part is that this movement no longer depends on us. It has a life of its own now." At that moment, Ricardo realized they had achieved something few entrepreneurs achieve. They had created something bigger than themselves, something that would continue to grow and impact the world even if they were no longer there. 2 years after becoming a cooperative, Ricardo found himself in a situation he never imagined, being invited to speak at the United Nations General Assembly on sustainable business models for the 21st century. He stood on stage, looking out at an audience of world leaders, CEOs of multinationals, and representatives of international organizations, but his mind flashed back to that night in the empty hallway when he found Jorge sweeping the floor. 3 years ago, he began, I was a failed businessman who thought he knew everything about business. Today, I'm a member of a cooperative that taught me I knew nothing about people. The audience laughed, but Ricardo continued seriously. And the difference between these two versions of me wasn't education, it wasn't capital, it wasn't strategy, it was humility. He pointed to the front row, where Jorge and the rest of the team were seated. These are my teachers, and they taught me that the future of business isn't in competition, but in collaboration. During the presentation, Ricardo presented figures that impressed even the most staunch skeptics. Our cooperative grew 2,000% in 2 years. But more importantly, companies that implemented our methods reported an average increase of 300% in employee satisfaction and 250% in talent retention. He clicked to the next slide. But the impact goes beyond the numbers. We've inspired the creation of 47 similar cooperatives in 12 different countries. The audience murmured, impressed. And each of these cooperatives adapted our principles to their local culture, creating variations that are better than the original. Jorge smiled from the audience, proud to see how the movement had evolved beyond his most optimistic expectations. What started as a 7-person company in Chicago has become a global movement for business democratization. After the presentation, Ricardo was surrounded by journalists, but the question that struck him most came from a young Brazilian reporter. "Mr. Monteiro, what would you say to business people who think your model is too idealistic to work in the real world?" Ricardo smiled. "I'd say they're right. Our model is too idealistic for the world as it is, but we're not trying to adapt to the world as it is. We're creating the world as it should be." He looked at Jorge, who nodded encouragingly. "And you know what the most interesting part is? When you stop accepting that things are just the way they are and start asking, why can't things be different? You discover that the only thing preventing change is the lack of courage to try." The reporter persisted. "But what about the risks? What if it fails?" Jorge stepped up to the microphone. "Can I answer that?" Ricardo nodded. "The biggest risk isn't trying something new and failing. The biggest risk is continuing to do something you know is wrong just because it's always been that way." That night, at the New York hotel, the team gathered for an impromptu celebration in Ricardo's room. "Do you realize how far we've come?" Maria said, looking out the window at the illuminated city. 3 years ago, I was an invisible cleaner. Today, I'm co-owner of a company that's changing the world." Carlos laughed. "And I was a handyman that no one took seriously. Today, I have patents for 3 inventions that are being used in factories around the world." Anna added, "The most incredible thing is that we haven't changed who we are. We just finally had the chance to show who we've always been." João, always the group's philosopher, said, "Do you know what the real revolution we've made is? We proved that competence has no social class, that leadership doesn't need a title, and that success doesn't have to come at the expense of others." Pedro, organizing some documents as he always did, added, "And we proved that when you treat people like people, not resources, they do extraordinary things." Ricardo looked at each of them. People who had been invisible to the world, but who were now internationally recognized as pioneers of a new way of doing business. "Do you know what I've learned in these 3 years?" Everyone turned to him. "I learned that leadership isn't about being at the top of the pyramid. Leadership is about serving the people who make the real work happen." Jorge smiled. "And I learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what truly matters." Ricardo nodded. "We lost titles, we lost hierarchies, we lost the illusion of control. But we gained purpose. We gained family. We gained the chance to leave the world a little better than we found it." Maria raised her glass of water. "Then let's toast." Everyone raised their drinks. To what we lost, to what we gained, and to what we will still build together. The toast echoed through the room, sealing not just a celebration, but a renewed commitment to the values that had transformed 7 ordinary people into agents of global change. At that moment, Ricardo realized that his true legacy wasn't in numbers, awards, or international recognition. His true legacy lay in the living proof that it was possible to do business with soul, lead with humility, and succeed without losing one's humanity. 5 years after that night in the hallway, Ricardo woke up one Sunday morning and decided to do something he hadn't done in a long time. Walk alone through the building that had been the scene of his transformation. He climbed from the basement to the 40th floor, stopping at each floor to observe how the space had evolved. What was once a monument to the entrepreneurial ego now housed 3 different cooperatives, a collaborative leadership training center, and even a free technical school that Jorge had insisted on creating. "Funny," he muttered to himself. "When I built this building, I wanted it to be a symbol of my success. Now it's a symbol of something much greater." He reached his old office on the 40th floor, which was now a community library, and sat in the same chair where he had signed so many greed-driven contracts. Who would have thought that the greatest achievement of my life would be learning to share instead of hoarding? Jorge found him there an hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee as he always did. "I knew I'd find you here," he said, offering one of the cups. "You always come here when you're thinking about the past." Ricardo smiled. "Actually, I was thinking about the future, about what we can still do." Jorge sat in the chair next to him, the same one he used to sit in when he was still just a janitor. And what do you see in the future? Ricardo pointed to the window, where the city stretched to the horizon. I see a world where every company operates like ours, where every worker is treated as a partner, where every leader serves instead of commanding, where every business exists to improve people's lives, not just to generate profit. Jorge laughed. You're still a dreamer. Ricardo shook his head. No, Jorge. I'm a realist who learned that the biggest dreams are the only ones worth pursuing. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the city awaken below. Jorge, Ricardo finally said, do you regret anything? Turning down the CEO position, insisting on the cooperative, betting on people the world considered disposable. Jorge thought for a moment. You know what I regret? Taking 25 years to find the courage to be who I really was. Wasting so much time trying to fit into molds that weren't made for me. He looked at Ricardo. And you? Do you regret anything? Ricardo laughed. I regret taking so long to understand that success isn't about how much you have, but how much you give. That leadership isn't about how many people work for you, but how many you serve. He paused. But mostly, I regret almost missing the chance to really get to know you. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Maria, Carlos, Ana, João, and Pedro, who had arranged to meet to plan the cooperative's next project, a corporate university that would teach collaborative management principles to companies around the world. Sorry to interrupt your philosophical moment, Maria said, smiling, but we have work to do. Carlos laughed. Yeah, enough nostalgia. The world won't transform itself, Ana added, and we have a waiting list of 500 companies wanting to learn our methods. João showed a folder full of invitations, and 20 countries wanting to implement similar cooperatives. Pedro, ever practical, said, and we have to decide how we're going to scale this without losing the essence of who we are. Ricardo stood up, energized by the prospect of new challenges. Then let's get to work. But first let me say something. Everyone stopped and looked at him. 5 years ago, I thought I knew what success was. I had money, power, recognition, but I was an empty man, surrounded by people who feared or flattered me, but who didn't truly know me. His voice grew intense. Today I have something money can't buy. I have a family that chose me, not out of self-interest, but out of affinity. I have a purpose that motivates me every day. I'm certain that when I die, the world will be a little better because I passed through here. Jorge smiled. And we're certain we've found not just a partner, but a brother, Maria added, and living proof that people can change when they find the right environment to grow. Carlos laughed. And a boss who finally learned that he doesn't need to be a boss to lead, Ana said. And an example that humility is the greatest strength there is, João concluded, and confirmation that when you treat people like people, miracles happen. Pedro, always organizing, said, and now let's stop praising each other and get to work, because we have a world to transform. Everyone laughed and headed for the door, but Ricardo paused for a moment and took one last look out the window. Below, the city bustled with millions of people going to work, most of them in companies that still operated under the old model. One day, he murmured, one day all these people will work with dignity, purpose, and joy. Jorge, who had heard, put his hand on his friend's shoulder. And that day will come because we planted the seed. The spark we lit here will spread throughout the world. Ricardo smiled. The eternal spark of hope that work can be more than survival. It can be fulfillment. And with that certainty in their hearts, they walked downstairs together to continue the quiet revolution they had begun in an empty hallway on a cold Chicago night. When a bankrupt businessman met a wise janitor and discovered that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what truly matters.